again. If you weren't here before, my name's Jesse. How are you all doing? Still good? The last lot were louder. Come on. There we go. I personally am very excited for this next talk. I'm sure you are as well. Who's ready for one of the most exciting talks of this entire PyCon? There we go. I want to get straight into it, so without further ado, please welcome Caitlin Wright.
Hello, my name is Kate. My pronouns are she, her, and for the last 10 or so years, I've been working in the VFX industry on feature films, television shows, commercials, social media campaigns, and out-of-home content as a visual effects artist / systems administrator / pipeline TD. Before we go too much further, I do want to say that there was no AI or machine learning or whatever we're calling it these days used in the creation of this talk. All mistakes, all moments of weird phrasing, all opinions were typed with these hands alone. Given the prevalence of all of that these days, this particular point feels kind of important to make clear. I'll also say that this is not a super technical talk. I'm not going to be showing any code or anything like that. This is a very high-level rundown on the VFX workflow and how we as programmers can do some of the heavy lifting behind the scenes to glue parts of the workflow together to make our colleagues' lives easier. So in that vein, this talk is called Keeping Creativity, the Focus in Visual Effects and Animation, which is kind of unwieldy and doesn't really explain a lot about its content. So I'm glad as many of you showed up as you did, so thank you for that. I think it's just visual effects and animation sounds really compelling. I did want to call it something like PyCon Talk version 3, final, this one parentheses, copy 2.1.text, which is kind of worse. This talk is about how we avoid file names like that, and how we use Python in visual effects to develop tools and automations that keep file names sane, keep directory structures intact, and how that ultimately helps keep our artists focused on doing actual art and less worried about how they should be naming files, where they should be putting them, and what file format they should be. By the way, this happy little Viking lady, let's put it the right way up again. At the studio I used to work for, she's me. The studio I used to work for, we each had a CG character that represented us. I ended up as a Playmobil Viking, and I think that's because before I transitioned, I was cranky all the time and had a terrible beard. Now I'm just the former. Anyway, we did little vignettes with these characters in our downtime, and today we're going to go into a bit more detail about one of those and how we're able to very efficiently and effectively go from concept to iteration to final product. But I'll get into that a bit later. Firstly, I suspect most of you know what visual effects artists and systems administrators do, at least broadly, but I suspect pipeline TD is a lesser known job title. So I'll simplify it by breaking it down into its basic components. There's pipeline and there's TD. Let's start with TD. TD stands for Technical Director. That term is a bit too grandiose for what we actually do. At our core, a pipeline TD is someone who is intricately familiar with the aspects of a particular part of the visual effects workflow, that they're not just performing artistry, but also figuring out how to best approach it from a technical standpoint. The term TD is typically prefixed with a part of the workflow or the application that they're familiar with. For example, a light and render TD is someone who doesn't just light shots, but they're also involved in discussions on approaching rendering difficult shots, with lots of components while keeping the render times reasonable, and is also involved in troubleshooting any failed or problematic renders. Pipeline is what we're here to discuss today. Like lots of things in this industry, pipeline is an overloaded term. It is at once the broad term for the overall VFX workflow that happens from client brief to the delivery of final files. And it's also the colloquial term for the code that wraps the applications that we use to produce the work during said workflow. In this talk, I'll be using pipeline to refer to the code and workflow to refer to the workflow. So that workflow, here's a graph representing the data flow that we'd use for a typical VFX shot. The things on the left are upstream of the things on the right, so they need to happen first before the rest of the shot can progress, but there's a bit of work that can happen simultaneously from various artists across the different steps of the shot, which is a boon for minimizing overall project runtime, but it's a nightmare for the producers and coordinators whose job it is to try and schedule tens, hundreds of shots, and make sure that everything's on track as it progresses. The upshot, at least for us here today, is we're going to focus on the 3 steps we're going to focus on today are entirely linear. They are animation, lighting, and compositing. Animation is sort of self-explanatory. An animator takes a rigged 3D model and animates it so that it moves, like puppeteering. Lighting is immediately downstream of animation, and it involves a lighter taking the animated character mesh, as well as a virtual camera, and creates virtual lights that, evoke a specific mood or creates a specific feeling. They're also involved in rendering it, which is taking the 3D scene and turning it into 2D frames. Compositing then follows lighting, and the compositor, as the name suggests, creates a composite of, the render and other elements. So most of the time, this would include what we call a plate, which is what was shot on set during the production phase. And so they'd take the CG elements and they'd composite that over the top and integrate it. This would include things like blooms, glows, color grade, and the old J.J. Abrams lens flare. Yay! These are the departments that in most circumstances get the most time allocated per shot, and they're the ones that make the shot feel like it's actually progressing. As such, a lot of the code that we write for the pipelines is centered around these 3 steps and ensuring that these artists can iterate effectively and then efficiently publish their work to the next step of the workflow. Before we get too deep into that though, let's look at the little vignette that I alluded to earlier. It's really short, 4 seconds long, 100 frames total, and it loops. Isn't she adorable? So if we go back to the topic of this talk, keeping creativity the focus, we were able to turn this around really quickly. As I mentioned before, everyone in the team had a character, so my character already existed as part of the library. I wanted to do something for Transgender Day of Visibility this year, so I came up with the concept, pitched it to my producers and supervisors, who were on board, thankfully, and then they briefed the animator. Once it was animated, it came to me to light, render, and comp, and that's the final product. Because we had the pipeline in place, the animator could just animate. The model and rig were in the place that they should be, so he referenced them into his scene, and then when he was finished animating, he was able to publish the animation geometry to me, the lighter, who knew exactly where to find it because the tools put it in the place that it should be. Then once I'd lit it, I rendered it, and the renders automatically went to the place that the render should go with all of the correct AOVs, so that when I started compositing, I didn't need to look for them. Then when I'd finished comping it, I rendered it from that, and the comps went to the place that they should go, so that the person who was mastering it, that is, taking the frames, the individual EXRs, and turning it into a movie file, knew where to look for them. It sounds simple, right? It's really not that hard to name a file correctly and put it in the right place, is it? So why do we need this? Some of you know where this is going. It costs time and money to develop this automation. Can't people just name their files correctly and put them in the right place? Nope. I've seen some really chaotic file names and locations, people just putting things where they think they should go, not being consistent with that place, or the names of their files, or even the types of files. So we built a pipeline. But how do we build a pipeline? Well, they're built and maintained by pipeline TDs. So using the definition from before, a pipeline TD is someone who is familiar with the pipeline in both senses of the term, and is responsible for the technical parts of that, generally code and troubleshooting. In most studios, the pipeline is entirely custom with very few off-the-shelf tools used to glue everything together. The team of pipeline TDs each specialize in a part of the workflow. For example, the aforementioned light and render TD, if they're also familiar with code, would be involved in the development of the lighting pipeline, and to a lesser extent, the animation and compositing pipelines too. Similarly, an effects TD would be involved in the development of the simulation and character effects pipelines, and would coordinate with the animation and rigging TDs and the light and render TDs to make sure that the data they're receiving and publishing is accurate. There are also more generalized pipeline TDs and backend developers who more directly focus on the core of the pipeline, the classes and methods and database logic that underlies everything. This extreme level of customization between studios is due to each one having a vastly different scale of projects, team size, and coverage across the world. For example, you have ILM, Industrial Light and Magic, perhaps the most popular and well-known studio in the world, who employ somewhere over 1,000 artists globally. Then you've got RSP, Rising Sun, who are marginally more local, but employ somewhere in the region of 200 to 300 artists across Australia. And then you've got smaller, more boutique studios who employ closer to 10 to 20 artists within a single city. And so a pipeline that works for ILM, which is designed to operate at such an enormous scale, won't work for a small boutique studio because there's so much overhead required to keep a Marvel project up and running compared to a 30-second advertisement. Personally, my experience, it's in the 10 or so boutique and nimble kind of studio to the approximately 100 artist small studio range. I've been able to apply the same core methodology to both, but the scale at which the methodology applies and the strictness with which we eliminate granular control per artist differs. Every VFX pipeline I've ever maintained, every pipeline across the world for that matter, uses Python at its core. That's the language that studios and software vendors have all agreed to use, well, mostly Agreed. There are some glaring exceptions of vendors who refuse to conform to Python and instead use TypeScript or their own custom language, which causes no end of frustration for TDs everywhere. But most, all vendors who develop good software that is designed to operate at scale support Python. The VFX industry has a set of guidelines called the VFX Reference Platform. This dictates specific versions of various softwares that studios and vendors should adhere to for consistency. Things like the core Python version, versions of PyQt and NumPy and their ilk that get used all over the place. As of 2025, Python 3.11.x is the target release. It may shock you to know that we as an industry only moved away from Python 2.7 a very small number of years ago. And a lot of studios are still running Python 2.7 today just due to the sheer amount of legacy code that was written when we were all stuck in 2.7. So there's a lot of 2.7 that's still running around. With all of that in mind, we have a base with which to start or continue development on a pipeline. We have a group of TDs who all work for the same studio. They understand the goals and the needs of that studio, understand what versions of each application they need to be supporting, and the underlying versions of Python and the various libraries that need to be taken into account. And by their powers combined, they are able to, more or less, just develop like any other team of software engineers would, because ultimately, at our core, that's what we are. We use Git, we write unit tests, we have stand-ups, we do all the things that normal development teams would do, but we just do it for a VFX studio rather than for a software company. So let's look at the pipeline in action. All of the pipeline TDs have done their job to the best of their ability. The code exists, it's functional, and it's been published to the floor of however many artists are working at whatever studio they've been hired by. The individual experiences of the artists depend on the studio they're working for, and by extension, what the pipeline looks like. But ultimately, the core of each pipeline does a similar thing and has custom interfaces that operate under a very similar set of assumptions. The artist is working on one of two things: a shot or an asset. A shot is a single continuous piece of action between cuts in an edit, or put more simply, the moment between when a camera operator presses the start recording button and the stop recording button. An asset is a single CG component, for example, a CG character, or an effect like an explosion, or a cityscape, or other environment that is to be used across multiple shots, and so needs to exist outside of a shot in the hierarchy of the project. In order to start working on a shot or an asset, the application needs to know what shot or asset the artist is working on, and like what they're doing for that shot, whether they're animating, lighting, compositing, rigging, simming, whatever else. And if there are any other specifics to that component. For example, an effects artist might have multiple effects to produce for a single shot, and so they might describe one scene by its shot code, and then simulation, and then a unique descriptor like water, if they're doing a fluid simulation, for example. And then when it comes to working on another effect, they might use the same shot code, that same pipeline department, simulation, and then a different descriptor, for example, fur, if they're doing character effects stuff. They punch this information into a small user interface, and the application goes, great, I know where to save this file and what to call it. The artist simply needed to provide some small amount of information, all of which they would have been given by someone else anyway. And from that, the pipeline code is able to infer everything else. So that's the first step. The scene file exists on disk, in the right place, and presumably some other pipeline magic somewhere based on the project and shot code has correctly set the length of the shot, the frame rate, and other variables that need to be set in the scene. So the artist doesn't even need to think. They more or less tell the computer, this is what I'm working on, and the computer goes and sets it all up. Not only does this get the artist started quicker, but it eliminates error. There's no, what's the frame range for this shot? Or where should I save this file? It's just open scene, pick shot, and what you're doing, and oh look, you're ready to go. The next step is versioning. No one gets things right on the first try, and so we version our files. Most of our applications store everything as binary blobs of data, so using version control software doesn't make a lot of sense. Scene files are binary, renders are binary, geometry caches are binary. It's all just unreadable and generally moderately compressed garbage. So the game dev industry takes advantage of tools like GitLFS or Perforce or something like that. But game dev applications have first and third-party ways of integrating with version control systems. We don't have any of that in VFX. We typically work off network shares to make sure everyone can always access the latest data, and so that systems on the render farm don't need to perform checkouts or anything like that before they actually starts rendering, because that wastes CPU cycles, or though realistically these days it's GPU cycles. So we use a less technically refined but more accessible concept of versioning. It's a number and a file name. So let's take a new example. We have an artist working on a shot called Flag Wave. and they're animating my CG character that they looked at before. The first scene might be called something like flagwave anim v1cw. Sometimes we'll stick user initials on the end of a file, some other kind of unique identifier, so that we know who worked on it and can avoid conflicts. So when CW here publishes her work, she versions it up. Now the scene would have that's the wrong button, would have v2 in the name. It lives in the same directory, but it's a new file. She then does a few more versions, v3, v4, v5, and she finally gets it right by v41. Except then the client goes, actually, I really like the version from a week ago. And so we sigh and go, sure. We open the v26 scene and save that out as a new v42. This process of versioning is just pressing a button. The artist doesn't need to manually edit a file name or anything like that. They just press version up, and the pipeline goes, I know where I need to save this and I know what it needs to be called, and does it. Again, we eliminate the need for manual intervention and reduce the potential for human error. So animation is finished. They publish it to the next person in the workflow, the lighter. So they press a button, the publish or export button, depending on the studio you're working at, they call them different things. This button knows, based on what's in the scene, what the animator has done, what needs to be published. There's sometimes a bit of manual effort to say, yeah, I want this, I want this, I want this. But other than that, the rest is automated. They press a button and voila, the geometry is exported in the correct file format, in the correct place with the correct names. In this case, it would be something like flagwave anim Kate, v42 for the character, and flagwave anim flag, v42 for the flag. And then there's also a camera that goes along with it. So the lighter comes along, imports all of the assets for the shot, and they tell their application similar information to what the animator did. I'm working on flagwave, I'm lighting, they get a similar file name. Flagwave, light, v001, CW. And then they have an interface that is context-aware and allows them to import the latest version of every asset in the shot that has been published from animation or from effects. They press a button and get everything. The character, the props, the camera, the materials that need to be assigned to the camera, to the geometries, and the correct material assignments to go for everything. So that all they need to do is worry about doing the creative portion of their job, the stuff that they actually enjoy, the lighting. They light the scene, render it a bunch of times, versioning up each time, but somewhere along the line, the client goes, actually, can we change the animation? Which is annoying, but it happens. There's room left in the budget, so we go, sure. And so the animator makes another change. They go to v47, they publish their animation, and then the lighter reopens their scene, receives a warning. There's new animation published, v47. That's newer than the v42 that's in your scene. Do you want to load this? Yeah, I do. And it automatically updates. The lighter then renders it with the new animation, submits it for review, and the supervisor and the client love it. Great. So then the lighter publishes that version to the compositor. The render's already done because that's how they went to review, so the lighter tells the compositor, grab the latest render. They open up their application. They tell it, I'm working on flagwave. I'm comping. They get a new file. I think you see the pattern here. The examples I've used thus far are about file management, and that's a huge part of it. But we also do things like making wrappers for some of the workflows within the artist's applications. Things like press this button to set the correct resolution for the 3D renders you do, or press this button to import the virtual camera for this shot, or even press this button to apply the correct color transforms for your comp inputs and outputs. These are all parts of artist workflows that aren't strictly about naming files, but are important to making it sure that they always have the most accurate and up-to-date information available to them, and make sure that everything upstream of them and downstream of them is correct. Python as the universal language for VFX and animation works really well because it's such a simple language to begin picking up and prototyping with, without the requirement for a strict framework or boilerplate. There's also a really nice benefit in the fact that within our creative applications, we have a bit of a sandbox. We can directly interface with geometry or nodes or really anything within the application, and so it's a lot less abstract to play around with. Additionally, Python being a language that is capable of running within a REPL means that we can very easily write or troubleshoot our code without needing to spend a lot of effort. It means that the artists can, if they want to, write their own code. Python is a very accessible language to someone who only has a small amount of technical knowledge and is interested in automating small bits and pieces of their team and their team's workflow. They don't need to be a pipeline TD for that. They can just bolt together a couple of lines of code within their application and make their lives and their team's lives so much better. So this may lead to an obvious question. How restrictive is the pipeline? At what point does the artist become a technician and is just pressing buttons rather than doing the work that they actually enjoy? There's a fine line between making things easier and making things limiting. Being a part of being a technical director is making these decisions. We need to ensure that things are regimented enough that we can automate the more human error-prone parts of the workflow, but flexible enough to be able to hack around it when we're up against a deadline. The larger the team, however, the more regimented the pipeline needs to be. If someone can break something, they will. And the more people there are in the team, the more likely you'll have someone break something, intentionally or otherwise. In a small team, when you need to break the rules, you can very easily communicate this with each other. In a crew of hundreds, where you're not sure who your downstream artist is, whether they're in the same building or even the same country as you, that's so much harder. So on one hand, we need to make sure that artists aren't required to extend beyond their means, that they can focus on being creative rather than being distracted by the technical side of things. Ultimately, this benefits everyone. Most artists don't care about the tech, they just want to do the cool thing that they love doing and that they're passionate about. Producers want the files to end up in the right place so that everything runs smoothly. And the supervisor wants to be able to easily and efficiently review each artist's work without having to dig through squillions of files to do so. On the other hand, we need to take into account the moments when everything is on fire. I was meant to press a button a while ago. On the other hand, we need to take into account the moments when everything is on fire. These account for maybe the 0.5% of times, and these moments are outside of everyone's control. Sometimes the correct thing to do in a given situation is throw out the rules to ensure that a project is delivered on time. It's 2 a.m., a render's failing, and it needs to go to the director for review by 9 a.m. The pipeline TDs are asleep because it's 2 a.m., and the CG soup and the lighter are in troubleshooting mode. Ultimately, they need to be able to do whatever is required to get the shot rendering. The pipeline in these moments is just getting in the way, and so they need to be able to ignore it to just get the shot working. Most of the time, though, the skies are blue, the grass is green, and as such, there is enough of a requirement, given the sheer scale of projects these days, for a pipeline that each studio will hire non-billable crew to make sure that it exists, is stable, and that it functions as it should. Pipeline TDs aren't typically doing shot work. They're not creating the thing that ends up in the movie or the ad or whatever. They're just working on the tools that make the artist's workflows more efficient. They're a force multiplier. With all that in mind, though, the restrictions, the rule breaking, and whatever mess we end up making to get the job done, the beauty of working in visual effects and animation is that once the project is finished, it's over. It's archived and put to tape. There's no ongoing maintenance. There's no real need for future-proofing. At worst, we restore an archive, and the files are a bit messy because everyone got a bit overwhelmed at the end and started saving things in weird places, weird file names like we saw at the start. We're lucky that once a project is done, we start a fresh one, and everything is clean again. For boutique studios, this time frame is typically single-digit weeks. For bigger studios, this can be months, but it's not a website that needs to be operational for years, or a piece of software that needs to be operational for decades. We can afford the flexibility. The pipeline, however, is a piece of software that needs to be operational for a long time. It does need constant maintenance and improvements, and it doesn't get discarded at the end of a project. At the end of a project, I'll mentally go through the list of all the things that happened, make a list of what could have worked better, what broke, what got in the way, and what worked really well. Luckily, I'm an artist as well as a pipeline TD, so I get to experience firsthand all of the things that go wrong, and that puts me in a pretty good position to be able to figure out how to solve them for everyone else. And that's the loop. The project ends, the TDs all go, that was a bit rubbish, but that worked great. They make some updates, and then the next project kicks off. They'll be making those updates long into the next project's runtime because their work is never done. There's always something that breaks, something that doesn't work as expected, or something that doesn't behave the way the artists want it to. And so we keep updating it, making it better. It's a living, breathing part of the studio. Thank you for your time. I hope I was able to offer a small amount of insight into the black box that is VFX and animation, that you got at least something out of this talk. If this has at all sparked any kind of interest in working in the VFX or animation industries, I strongly recommend doing a bit of research into studios in your city, seeing if there are TD jobs available. Studios are kind of always on the lookout for more pipeline crew, especially as projects ramp up, and there are always projects ramping up. To my mind, and a lot of my colleagues, Format and Current, agree with this, you don't need any media or film or creative experience to be a pipeline TD. It's much easier for us to teach a programmer the ins and outs of the VFX workflow, media formats, all that, than it is to teach a creative how to code. So definitely jump on whatever search engine you choose to use and see what's around if you're at all interested. One last point on a less technical note, if you're transgender, non-binary, or otherwise gender diverse and or non-conforming, then the VFX industry is a really great place to be. I work with other trans women, and it's really great that we're part of an industry where we just get to be ourselves and do what we love doing without being judged or criticized. Like my character before, that was originally designed before I transitioned, and then my team was just like, we're going to change it because this is who you are now. That's everything I have to say. If you have any questions about that or anything in this talk, come find me, or I think we're hopefully going to have time for questions. Yeah, we'll have a chat. Thanks very much.